Okay, we're together again talking about biblical genre, the variety of scripture that we find within the Bible. Again, many times people will say, "Man, I don't understand that Bible," and many times the reason is that we haven't understood that this is not a flat Bible. That is, you can't just take any verse and put it up next against another verse. This is There's a variety of types of literature. I'm looking at a page here in Isaiah. Just open this up, and here's a section that is, it's in poetic typeset because it is biblical poetry inside of the prophecy of Isaiah. And so you have the prophetic element and the poetic element that are combined here. Then there's a section right in here about this is what, then it becomes narrative. There's variety a lot of times even within a book. And there are slightly different rules for understanding different types of literature. And we understand this intuitively. You know, if you turn on a television and there's maybe a rerun of a favorite sitcom of yours, you know that it's there to be funny. It's not there to make big serious points. That's the genre, the type of show that it is. You change the channel, and they're showing 1979's Alien. You know that's going to be scary, and it's horror, science fiction. Totally different. We have that kind of total difference that you'll find in the pages of Scripture too. So today we're talking about biblical prophecy, and boy, I love this topic. Now, let's start with the Old Testament because that's, we have these big books in the Old Testament that are called prophetic books. You've got Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth. There's a bunch, and then there's Daniel, and then there's 12 what we call minor prophets. By the way, they're not minor because they're unimportant. They're minor because they're short. And in the Hebrew Bible, it's actually called the Book of the 12. They just take all those together and call it one book. And even though they're not in chronological order or length order or anything, they're just all there together. But we have to understand also that when we talk about prophecy in Scripture, reading biblical prophecy, there are a number of books that we don't think of as prophetic that were lumped with the prophets in the Hebrew order of the Old Testament. Many Jews call the Old Testament the Tanakh, and that is T-N-K, and T is Torah, the N is Nevi'im, which means prophets, and then there's Ketuvim, which is the writings, which is primarily the Psalms and some of the other poetic books. And the interesting thing is there's not a section called the historical books, because even the historical books, I'm dropped down in 2 Kings here in my Bible. This is considered part of the prophecy because it's about the future. That is the minor use of the meaning of the word prophecy in Scripture, is because it is bringing forth the will of God to His people. That's the role of a prophet. A prophet's job is to represent God to His people. A priest's job, by the way, is to represent the people before God. That's why they offer the sacrifices. So you have that prophetic history, and when we talk about biblical prophecy, there's also prophecy, that proclamation element, richly in the Gospels and in the letters of the New Testament and the book of Revelation. Now, what are the elements of biblical prophecy? The role of a prophet and the role of a prophetic book is to call people back to the covenant of God. That is their role. Say, here is the covenant that God has made. Here are the scriptures that God has already given. I call you to come back to faithfulness to the Lord. I was in Israel in 2006, and I actually ended up overhearing a conversation between two observant Jews, and they were saying, one was saying to somebody else, and then the other one chimed in and agreed. It says that in many ways, the whole of Scripture is a call to come back to God and to forsake idolatry. Well, that's pretty good. I think there's more to it than that, but that's not bad. And it's a very Old Testament attitude to remember. So to reinforce the covenant, to proclaim God's will with some prediction. And in the predictions, you'll have short-term and long-term Scripture. It's short-term and long-term prophecy. If you look at the prophecy about Emmanuel, you'll find that this is in Isaiah chapter 9, I believe, that there, yes, to us a child is born, to us a son is given. Okay, that there's a short-term fulfillment of this in the time of Isaiah, but there's also a long-term fulfillment of this with the coming of Jesus, the Messiah. He's so there's a short-term, long-term, and we often sometimes we'll find prophecy that almost feels like looking at a range of mountains where there's some things that are close and some things that are farther away and some things that are farther away from that. But just reading the passage, you can't really tell. There's a jump in between. You have to see the fulfillment of that to really get that. When you read prophecy, you know, we're going to talk about this a little bit more, some other types of scripture. The smart thing to do is to read oracles. And right now you're going, what on earth do you mean by reading oracles? What you have to do when you read Old Testament prophecy in particular is you have to see where is the beginning of this idea and where is the end of this idea. How does it all connect? Because, for example, here is Isaiah 13, which is a prophecy against Babylon. Then there's a complete change of topic in chapter 14. Okay, so you have to think what is the oracle? Not just look at it as individual verses, but see how it all hangs together, and that makes a whole lot more sense. So many times when we try to understand this from the standpoint of the New Testament, what we have to do is think in terms of Israel, the church, and the Messiah. How much of this is just about Israel? How much of this reaches beyond this? How much of this is about the Messiah? Again, as New Testament Christians, we have to read the Old Testament through the glasses of the New Testament. That's what we're called to do by Jesus and Paul and others in the New Testament. And I give you a quick example of this. Is one of the most famous prophecies of Scripture is the prophecy about the suffering servant in Isaiah, which actually we always say Isaiah 53. Actually starts in Isaiah 52 verse 13 through 53 verse 12. See, that's what we mean talk about think oracles, because the suffering service passages is actually the fourth of prominent servant songs in Isaiah that start in Isaiah 42, then 49, and then 50, describing the servant's obedience and it's the servant's suffering. One of my professors points out that you kind of think of it as a pyramid, with the bottom level being all of Israel, and then the middle is faithful Israel, and the top is simply the Messiah. You think there's a progression as you do that, so that some people say, "Oh, this is all about Israel." Well, it kind of started that way in Isaiah 40, but as it progresses, it's the remnant, and as it progresses further, it's just the servant. As you get down to an individual, he grew up before him like a tender shoot. He had no beauty or majesty. He was despised and rejected by men. He took our infirmities and carried our sorrows. The idea that Israel carries its own burdens and sorrows and suffers, and the servant becomes vicarious sufferer. And verse 6, we all like sheep have all gone astray. Each one of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It eventually becomes just a person. So again, when we talk about prophecy, we have to, from a New Testament standpoint, we have to read it through New Testament glasses, and then we read the oracles, understand what the prophet's job was, and how the books of prophecy carry this out, and how we relate to that, and how it points us ultimately to Jesus the Messiah. Well, we'll pick this up another time, and we're going to be talking about Gospels and Acts next. So until then, bye-bye.